Welcome to Founding Chronicles, your home for the untold stories of America's past. Before we dive into today's tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And hit that bell icon so you never miss a story from the Old West. Now, settle. And as we journey back to Montana, 1860, and uncover the macabre life of liver-eating Johnson, a savage mountain man whose legend still haunts the peaks and valleys of the frontier. In the vast, untamed wilderness of Montana in the 1860s, the land stretched endlessly, a sea of jagged mountains, dense forests, and roaring rivers. It was a place where life and death danced on the same thread, where men were measured not by words, but by their deeds. Among these rugged peaks and shadowed valleys, a man named John Liver-Eating Johnson would carve his legend, one of vengeance, violence, and survival so raw that the echoes of his story would haunt the Montana frontier for generations to come. Johnson was not born into a life of comfort or civility. His early years were modest, framed by the harsh realities of frontier living, where every meal was earned and every enemy could strike without warning. Yet, even in those formative days, there was something different about him, a glint in his eye, a silent intensity that set him apart from the boys who ran barefoot through the valleys. The mountains themselves seemed to whisper his name, as if the land recognized the fire that would one day burn through the hearts of those who dared cross him. Johnson's path to infamy began long before his name struck fear into the hearts of the Crow people and the settlers alike. He grew up understanding the brutal honesty of nature, where the snow could suffocate, the rivers could drown, and the wolves would not hesitate to claim the weak. His father, a man hardened by the wilderness, taught him how to track game, build a fire in the fiercest storms, and read the signs left behind by animals and men alike. But it was the lessons of patience and silence that Johnson absorbed the most. In the mountains, he learned that the quietest hunter often survived while the loudest fool perished. And as the years passed, his skills grew sharper, his resolve harder, until the boy became a man who could move through the wilderness like a shadow. Unseen and unstoppable. Montana in the 1860s was no place for the faint-hearted. The gold rush had brought a flood of fortune-seekers, prospectors, and opportunists, and with them came lawlessness, greed, and violence. Native tribes, particularly the Crow and Blackfeet, had long called this land home, and the arrival of settlers stirred a simmering tension into open conflict. Amid this volatile landscape, Johnson's life would become inexorably tied to a cycle of revenge and bloodshed, a cycle sparked by love, loss, and the cruel hand of fate. His first encounter with tragedy would etch into him a darkness that few could understand. He fell deeply in love with a woman from the frontier, a quiet, gentle soul whose laughter could light even the bleakest of winters. For a time, the mountains seemed to soften, and even the harshest winds carried a hint of warmth. But that fragile peace was shattered by a brutal attack from a band of Crow warriors. The woman he loved was taken from him, killed in a manner so cruel and deliberate that it seared itself into Johnson's mind, leaving a wound that could not be healed by time or tears. From that day forward, Johnson's life took on a singular purpose: vengeance. He did not seek mere survival anymore. He sought justice, a reckoning against those who had torn his world apart. He pursued the killers relentlessly, learning their ways, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, and letting the mountains themselves guide him. What began as grief transformed into something far more fearsome, a methodical, relentless pursuit of retribution. Johnson's reputation began to spread across the valleys and rivers. Settlers whispered of a man who could appear from nowhere, whose aim with a rifle never faltered, and whose cunning rivaled that of the cleverest wolves. The Crow, too, spoke his name in hushed tones, wary of the man who seemed to embody the very spirit of the unforgiving wilderness they called home. But Johnson was more than just a man of vengeance. He was a survivor in every sense of the word. The mountains tested him daily, demanding ingenuity and courage. Harsh winters forced him to track animals over frozen rivers and snow-laden plains. Summers brought mosquitoes, relentless heat, and the ever-present threat of fire. Yet in every season, Johnson adapted, learning from the land itself, blending into it until he became one with the harsh Montana terrain. He could read a trail like a book, predict a storm before it arrived, and move through dense forests with the silence of a ghost. His skills were not just tools, they were extensions of his very being, forged in pain, sharpened by loss, and honed by an unyielding will to survive. It was this combination of grief, fury, and mastery of the land that gave rise to the macabre legend that would forever define him. The Crow had a name for him, though few dared to speak it aloud. The man who consumed his enemies' livers, a practice steeped in fear and mysticism. Some said it was symbolic, an act of ultimate vengeance meant to rob the dead of their strength and honor. Others whispered that it was literal, an act that made him a figure of terror across the Montana frontier. Whether true or myth, the story spread like wildfire, painting Johnson as a spectral force of justice and horror, a man who had become inseparable from the very wilderness that shaped him. Even as his legend grew, Johnson remained tethered to the human side of his tragedy. He was haunted by memories of the woman he lost, by the loneliness that gnawed at him like the cold winds of winter. He would sit beneath the stars, listening to the distant howls of wolves, thinking of what had been and what could never be. The mountains, vast and eternal, seemed indifferent to his pain, yet they also offered a strange solace. Here, amidst the peaks and valleys, Johnson found a sense of purpose, a mission that transcended mere survival. He was not just a man in the wilderness. He was a reckoning, a living embodiment of the raw, unforgiving justice that the Old West demanded. As the years went by, Johnson's name became inseparable from the landscape itself. Stories of his deeds traveled from mining camps to trading posts, whispered by men who had glimpsed him in fleeting encounters. They spoke of his uncanny ability to strike with precision, to appear where least expected, and to vanish without a trace. He was a shadow in the Montana wilderness, a relentless force that no man or tribe could predict. And yet, beneath the fear and fascination, there was a tragic human story. A man forged in love and loss, driven by grief, and transformed by a cycle of violence that neither the mountains nor the people could contain. By the time Johnson reached his 30s, the Montana wilderness had been both his teacher and his battlefield. He had become a master of survival, a symbol of terror, and a figure whose name would echo through the annals of frontier history. But even as his legend grew, so too did the loneliness that came with it. Each act of vengeance brought a fleeting satisfaction, quickly replaced by the hollow emptiness of a life spent in pursuit of ghosts. The mountains had given him strength, the rivers had taught him patience, and the forests had granted him stealth. Yet none could fill the void left by the woman who had first awakened his heart. And so, in the bitter cold of a Montana winter, Johnson continued to move through the wilderness, his eyes always searching, his heart always burning. He was no longer just a man. He was a force of nature, a shadow that haunted the frontier, a living testament to the ferocity of grief and the unrelenting power of vengeance. The story of liver-eating Johnson had only just begun, and the mountains themselves seemed to brace for the legend that was to unfold. The Montana wilderness had become Johnson's world in every sense. The peaks and valleys were not just his home, they were his allies, his accomplices in a life that demanded cunning, courage, and cruelty. By the early 1860s, word of his relentless pursuit of vengeance had spread like wildfire through the frontier settlements and even reached the ears of the Crow people themselves. To them, he was no longer just a man. He was an avenging spirit, a shadow moving silently among the mountains, claiming retribution in ways that blurred the line between legend and horror. His first confrontations were brutal, intimate affairs. Johnson would track the men who had torn his world apart with a patience that few could comprehend. Days and nights he spent following their trails, reading every sign, listening to every whisper of the wind for hints of their presence. The forests, thick with pine and fir, became his cloaking ground. The rivers, with their roaring currents, became markers in his mental map of revenge. In these moments, he was neither hero nor villain. He was a man possessed by grief and an unyielding desire for justice. And when he finally confronted his enemies, the violence was swift, merciless, and precise. It was not mere killing that earned him his dreadful moniker. Johnson had learned from the Crow that to strike an enemy at their very core, to remove the thumb, seat of their courage and strength, was the ultimate form of vengeance. Whether symbolic or literal, he developed a ritualistic habit of consuming the livers of those he killed, an act that cemented his reputation as a figure both terrifying and unstoppable. The settlers whispered about it in hushed tones around campfires. The Crow spoke of it in reverent fear, and those unfortunate enough to encounter him knew instinctively that mercy would never follow him into the mountains. It was a terrifying combination. A man guided by love lost, armed with unparalleled skill, and imbued with a relentless, almost supernatural sense of purpose. Johnson's life was far from solitary. Though he walked the line between man and myth, he occasionally encountered fellow frontiersmen, trappers, and settlers. Some sought his guidance, hoping to learn the secrets of survival in the merciless Montana wilderness. Others, driven by greed or ignorance, tried to hunt him down, believing they could put an end to the legend. In every case, Johnson's reputation preceded him. Those who approached him with respect were sometimes welcomed into his quiet world, learning survival skills that saved lives. Those who approached with malice were met with the same cold, calculating vengeance he had shown the Crow who had taken his beloved. His life was a delicate balance of solitude, violence, and rare moments of human connection, all framed by the wild, untamed landscape that shaped him. Despite his fearsome reputation, Johnson was not without complexity. He was a man of emotion, deeply tied to the grief that had set him on his path. At night, when the snow fell thick over the mountain passes, he would often pause to look at the stars, feeling the weight of his losses and the solitude of his existence. These moments of reflection did not make him weak. Rather, they reminded him of the humanity beneath the legend. His actions were violent, but they were born from love lost, from injustice suffered, and from a relentless pursuit of retribution. The wilderness, which had taken so much from him, had also given him the clarity and purpose to endure what no ordinary man could survive. Over time, the Crow learned to respect and fear him in equal measure. Some tried to anticipate his movements, setting traps and ambushes in hopes of ending his campaign of vengeance. Yet Johnson's understanding of the land was unmatched. He knew every creek, every ridge, and every hidden passage in the mountains, using them to outmaneuver those who thought themselves cleverer. When he struck, it was sudden and decisive, leaving behind nothing but whispers and horror. His enemies came to see him not as a man, but as a force of nature, something that could not be reasoned with, only endured or avoided. Johnson's reputation also reached the miners and settlers who were carving out a life in Montana's valleys. In the dusty towns and makeshift trading posts, men would exchange stories of encounters with the savage mountain man who consumed the livers of his enemies. Some of these tales were exaggerated, fueled by fear and imagination, but the truth behind them was undeniable. Johnson had become a symbol of frontier justice, an embodiment of the harsh, unforgiving wilderness that defined the Old West. Even those who never met him felt the weight of his presence, and the name Liver-Eating Johnson became a cautionary tale for anyone who underestimated the fury of a man wronged. Yet Johnson's life was not just a tale of killing and survival. It was also a story of ingenuity and endurance. He built his shelters carefully, often hidden deep within the forests or high in rocky crags where no one could follow. He learned to hunt with precision, trapping game and fishing the rivers with an almost spiritual connection to the land. Every action was deliberate, every movement calculated. He was a man in harmony with the wilderness, using its secrets to his advantage, and in turn, the land seemed to shelter him from the relentless cycles of conflict that surrounded him. The winters were the most punishing. Snowdrifts piled high, rivers froze, and temperatures dropped to unbearable lows. Many men perished in these conditions, their bodies claimed by the cold and isolation. But Johnson endured. He moved with a silent, determined grace through the kiln. White wilderness, his fire and skill keeping him alive while others succumbed. He learned to read the patterns of storms, to recognize the subtle signs of frostbite or hunger, and to plan his moves with an almost prophetic foresight. These years of harsh survival sharpened him, hardened him, and turned him into a living legend whose story would ripple through the valleys and mountains for decades. Amid this brutality, Johnson's grief remained a quiet, unyielding presence. He never forgot the woman who had sparked his path of vengeance, and he carried her memory like a torch in the darkness. It drove him, gave him focus, and reminded him of the justice he sought to exact. The act of killing, of pursuing his enemies, was never mindless. Each encounter was a carefully considered step in a journey of retribution, a path that honored the love he had lost and punished those who had destroyed it. His legend grew not merely because of his violence, but because of the emotional weight that fueled it. He was a man who had suffered, who had loved, and who had transformed grief into an unrelenting force of frontier justice. By the mid-1860s, Johnson's name had become inseparable from the Montana wilderness. Stories of his deeds traveled across rivers, over mountains, and into the homes of settlers who had never glimpsed him. Some tales were true, some embellished, but all carried the same essence. Johnson was a man of unmatched skill, relentless determination, and terrifying resolve. He had become the shadow that haunted the frontier, the embodiment of a wilderness that demanded respect, and a legend that blurred the line between reality and myth, even as he carved his path through vengeance. In survival, Johnson remained a figure of humanity beneath the fearsome exterior. He was capable of kindness, of reflection, of rare moments of connection with those who respected his way of life. But those moments were fleeting, easily overshadowed by the relentless march of revenge that had defined his life since the mountains first claimed his heart. The wilderness had forged him into something extraordinary, something terrifying, and something unforgettable, a man whose story would outlive him, whispered around campfires, told in hushed tones, and remembered in the echoes of the Montana mountains for generations. By the late 1860s, Johnson had become more than a man. He had become a specter haunting the mountains of Montana. The stories of his deeds, whispered across mining camps and small frontier settlements, had taken on a life of their own. Miners spoke of a shadow that appeared without warning, rifle in hand, eyes cold and unyielding, a figure who demanded respect not through words, but through the sheer force of presence. Travelers on the trails learned to move quietly, to avoid open plains where the mountains might hide him, and to listen for the faintest whisper of the wind which could betray his approach. To see Johnson was to confront the wilderness itself, a relentless, unforgiving force that brooked no weakness or hesitation. His campaigns of vengeance against the Crow were methodical and terrifying. Johnson did not strike out of impulse. He studied his enemies with patience that rivaled the most cunning predators. For months, he would track individuals, learning their routines, observing their habits, and understanding their weaknesses. The mountains gave him cover and guidance, shaping every move he made. When he struck, it was with a precision that left no doubt of his skill. Lives were ended swiftly, silently, and often in ways that left his enemies' tribes both enraged and awed. In the wilderness, there was no courtroom, no lawman to administer justice. Johnson became judge, jury, and executioner, delivering punishment that was brutal yet, in his mind, righteous. It was during these years that the rumors of his macabre ritual spread most widely. Some claimed that he had killed dozens of men, consuming their livers in a ritualistic act of revenge. Whether literal or symbolic, the stories cemented his reputation as a man beyond fear, a living embodiment of the unforgiving frontier. Settlers would exchange tales around flickering campfires, warning newcomers of the liver-eating man who roamed the mountains, while the crows spoke of him in reverent fear, a force that could not be outrun or outwitted. The legend was terrifying, yet it carried an undeniable truth. Johnson was a man who had mastered the wilderness, and in doing so, had become nearly unstoppable. Yet the life he led was not without its personal costs. The solitude required by his vengeance weighed heavily on him. Nights spent alone in the high passes, beneath skies thick with stars, reminded him of the woman whose loss had set his path into motion. Her memory haunted him like a ghost, a reminder of the life he could have had, a life unscarred by violence. In the quiet moments between acts of retribution, Johnson grappled with the emptiness that came from living for revenge alone. He was a man consumed by his own legend, a hero to some, a nightmare to others, but always a man alone in the vast, indifferent wilderness. The frontier itself became a partner in his legend. Rivers carved through valleys like veins, mountains rose like silent sentinels, and forests stretched in endless waves of green and shadow. Johnson moved through this landscape with a skill that bordered on the supernatural. He could disappear from a group of men in plain sight, vanish into the woods without a trace, and reappear miles away as if the mountains themselves had delivered him. Survivors of his encounters would speak of him with awe, recounting not only his violence but his uncanny ability to seem everywhere and nowhere at once. To them, he was a phantom, a force as untamed and unpredictable as the land itself. His encounters were not limited to the crow or his human enemies. The wilderness tested him constantly, and Johnson met every challenge with a mixture of ingenuity and sheer force of will. Wolves and mountain lions stalked him as he hunted through forests and snowbound valleys. Blizzards buried trails, rivers swelled with spring melt, and fire threatened to consume the dry timberlands. Each danger became a test, a crucible that honed his abilities and sharpened his instincts. Over time, Johnson became more than a man skilled in survival. He became an extension of the wilderness, his movements and decisions flowing with the rhythm of the mountains themselves. Despite the brutality of his life, there were rare moments of unexpected humanity. Johnson occasionally aided settlers caught in dire straits, providing food, guidance, or protection to those who respected the land and its dangers. He understood the balance of life and death in the wilderness, and in those fleeting acts of kindness, glimpses of the man beneath the legend emerged. But these moments were brief, quickly overshadowed by the demands of vengeance and survival. The world he inhabited allowed no long reprieves. Each day was a test, and each night could be the last if one were careless or weak. It was during one particularly harsh winter that Johnson's legend reached its peak. Reports of his exploits traveled even further, reaching distant towns and trading posts. Stories of men disappearing in the mountains, only to later be found, or sometimes never found at all, spread fear and fascination. Johnson's methods were meticulous. He would choose his targets carefully, strike with lethal efficiency, and vanish before anyone could respond. The Crow, both enraged and fearful, redoubled their efforts to track him. But Johnson's mastery of the terrain always gave him the upper hand. He moved like a shadow over the landscape, blending into the snow, the rocks, and the trees, a figure simultaneously of the land, and apart from it that by now Johnson's reputation had become larger than life. He was no longer just a man with a rifle. He was a symbol of frontier justice, an embodiment of the raw, unforgiving power of the Montana wilderness. Miners, trappers, and settlers spoke of him in reverent fear, telling tales of encounters that were as much moral lessons as they were warnings. To cross him was to invite death, yet to witness his actions was to understand the brutal honesty of the land itself. He had become a legend while still alive, his life a testament to the harsh reality of the Old West, where only the strongest, smartest, and most relentless could endure. Even in this period of heightened infamy, Johnson remained tethered to the memory of his lost love. Her absence fueled his relentless drive, shaping his decisions and guiding his actions. The mountains, for all their majesty and danger, had not hardened him into something purely monstrous. They had sharpened his sense of purpose, giving him clarity and focus amid the chaos. Every act of vengeance, every calculated strike, was an offering to the memory of what he had lost, a ritualistic attempt to balance the scales in a world that had once taken everything from him. And yet, as fearsome as he had become, there were moments when the weight of his life pressed upon him. Johnson understood, better than most, that a life lived solely for vengeance was a lonely one. The mountains, for all their beauty, offered no companionship, no solace beyond the quiet whisper of wind through the pines. He had become a master of survival, a phantom of the wilderness, and a figure whose name inspired terror, but the cost of such mastery was immense. He bore his solitude like a second skin, and though his enemies feared him, he feared the emptiness that followed each act of violence. By the end of this period, Johnson's legend had solidified in the collective memory of Montana. He was no longer merely a man living in the wilderness. He was an icon of frontier justice, a cautionary tale, and a testament to the unrelenting power of grief, skill, and survival. His story was far from over, yet even now, as men whispered his name in fear and awe, it was clear that the legacy of liver-eating Johnson would endure long after the snows of Montana had melted and the rivers had shifted their courses. He had become, in every sense, inseparable from the wilderness he called home, a living embodiment of the merciless, majestic, and unforgiving frontier. As the years passed, the Montana wilderness remained both Johnson's sanctuary and his battlefield. Time, which softens most men, seemed only to sharpen his resolve. His hair grayed, his face lined with the harsh imprint of decades in the mountains. Yet the fire that had driven him since the death of the woman he loved never dimmed. He was older, perhaps wiser, and the mountains had tested him in ways no human society could. Each scar on his body told a story of survival. Each wrinkle whispered of grief and determination, and every glimmer in his eyes reminded those who glimpsed him that he was far from defeated. Johnson had become more than a man. He was a living chronicle of the wilderness, a symbol of the unforgiving frontier, and a legend whose tale would be passed down for generations. By this time, the frontier itself was changing. Settlers poured into Montana, establishing towns, farms, and trading posts. Railroads began to stretch across the valleys, and the presence of lawmen and sheriffs grew more common. But even as civilization crept closer, Johnson remained a force apart, a shadow of the untamed past, resisting the encroaching order. He moved through forests and mountains that few dared to tread, his knowledge of the terrain unmatched, his instincts honed by decades of life in constant danger. The people who had once feared him now treated his name with reverence, a whispered caution to respect the land and the man who had mastered it. In these later years, Johnson began to reflect more deeply on the life he had led. The acts of vengeance that had defined his younger days now appeared in a more complicated light. He had killed many men, both Crow warriors and settlers who crossed him, and he had done so with precision and purpose. Yet the loneliness of those actions weighed heavily on him. Each life taken, no matter how justified by grief or necessity, left a shadow over his soul. The woman he had loved remained the central figure of his thoughts, the memory that had sparked a lifetime of fury and survival. In a quiet valley, beneath the towering pines, he would sometimes speak her name aloud, letting the wind carry his sorrow across the mountains. These were moments of vulnerability, rare glimpses of the man behind the myth, and they reminded him that even a legend is shaped by love and loss. Despite the solitude and reflection, Johnson's legend continued to grow. Miners and trappers, settlers and soldiers, all told tales of his exploits. The stories of the liver-eating mountain man had spread far beyond Montana, capturing the imagination of those who yearned for the drama and danger of the Old West. Some tales were exaggerated, others entirely fabricated, but all carried the essence of Johnson's life. A man who lived by his own rules, shaped by grief, honed by survival, and feared by those who had the misfortune of crossing him. His legend was now inseparable from the mountains themselves, a living memory embedded in the land and the people who traversed it. Yet Johnson was not merely a figure of fear. He was also a teacher of survival, a mentor to those who approached with respect and humility. Young men traveling into the wilderness sometimes sought him out, eager to learn how to endure the harsh winters, track game, and navigate the treacherous rivers. In these moments, Johnson revealed the depth of his knowledge and the sharpness of his intellect. He could explain the subtleties of tracking an elk, reading the signs of a snowstorm, or building a shelter from raw timber and stone. These acts of guidance were brief but impactful, and they allowed him to pass on his legacy beyond tales of vengeance and violence. Even a man like Johnson could leave a mark, not only through fear, but through wisdom. As he aged, Johnson also grappled with the morality of his actions. He had lived a life defined by loss and vengeance, yet he understood the thin line between justice and cruelty. The wilderness had taught him to survive, but it had also shown him the value of restraint, patience, and observation. He began to realize that his story was not only one of bloodshed, but also of endurance, skill, and resilience. These lessons, etched into his being by years of hardship, made him both a formidable figure and a profoundly human one, capable of reflection even after a life of relentless conflict. In the final years of his life, Johnson became something of a living legend in the eyes of the settlers and native tribes alike. His presence in the mountains was seen as both a warning and a testament to the raw power of the wilderness. Even as Montana grew more populated and the frontier slowly ceded to civilization, Johnson's story remained anchored in the untamed landscape, a reminder of an era when life was measured by courage, skill, and the ability to endure the harshest trials. Travelers would hear his name and feel a shiver of respect or fear. Parents would warn children of the liver-eating mountain man to teach caution and resilience. Johnson had transcended the bounds of ordinary life to become a symbol of the Old West itself. When Johnson finally passed away in the late 1880s, it was quietly far from the towns and settlements that now dotted Montana. He died as he had lived, immersed in the wilderness, surrounded by the land that had shaped him and tested him in ways no human could. There was no grand farewell, no ceremony, but his legacy endured far beyond his death. The mountains seemed to absorb his story, the rivers carried his memory, and the forests whispered his name. He became an eternal part of Montana, a figure who embodied both the beauty and brutality of the frontier. Historians, storytellers, and writers would later piece together the fragments of his life, creating accounts that blended fact and legend. Some emphasized the terrifying aspects of his vengeance. Others highlighted his unmatched survival skills and knowledge of the land. Together, these stories painted a portrait of a man who was fearsome yet human, brutal yet thoughtful, driven by grief yet capable of wisdom. Johnson's life was not simply a tale of violence. It was a chronicle of a man who survived in a world that demanded everything and gave little in return. Today, liver-eating Johnson remains a symbol of the Old West, a figure who embodies the raw, unrelenting spirit of frontier life. His story speaks to the resilience of the human spirit, the depth of grief and love, and the complex moral landscape of a time when the wilderness dictated the rules of survival. He was a man who walked the line between legend and reality, a figure who inspired fear and admiration alike, and a living testament to the enduring power of courage, skill, and the will to survive. The mountains of Montana, still wild and untamed, in places, carry the echoes of Johnson's life. Travelers, hikers, and historians who explore these lands may sense the shadow of the liver-eating mountain man, a presence born of history, memory, and the relentless passage of time. Johnson's story endures not merely because of the acts of vengeance he committed, but because it captures the essence of the Old West itself, a land of danger and beauty, of loss and survival, of men and women tested by circumstances greater than themselves. In the end, John Liver-Eating Johnson was more than a man. He was a symbol of the frontier's merciless grandeur, a reminder that history is shaped not only by kings and generals, but by those who live at the edge, who endure, who fight, and who leave their mark on the land itself. His life was macabre, yes, but it was also profoundly human, a story of love lost, vengeance sought, and survival against all odds. In every whisper of wind through the Montana pines, in every shadow across the rugged peaks, the legacy of liver-eating Johnson lives on, a haunting yet inspiring testament to the savage beauty of the Old West.